Hello again. So, continuing with my series on how I would reform the education system. Today we're going to talk about history. History is a bit of a difficult one to look at. So, my main solution is coming up again, teach it slower. But then there are other things that have to be looked at. So, let's look at history. A lot of history courses I've taken, high school and college, the teacher at the beginning of the course will talk about we have to cover so many years and the course is only so many days, so if we cover 1 year a day, we're still pushing it. And it's basically his way of saying, because most of these were male teachers who were saying this, don't ask too many questions because don't have time to answer them all. And there's also the whole concept of history's not full of simple answers. There are alternate versions. I'm not talking revisionist history here. I'm just talking about there are always deeper questions to ask. Yes, this happened. Why did it happen? Well, okay, we win, so we wrote the history. But what was the other side thinking? And was there any justification? Was it just, oh, they were just evil people, so they did this? Or was there something else going on that we don't see because it wasn't affecting us the same? So those are things teachers don't have time to get into, so they don't. So time is a problem. And history is not taught that way where, oh, we have to do 1 year a day. That's not the way history is usually taught. So that's a false argument the teacher's making. Because it's patterns of existence. Some of the things we'll cover years at a time just because it slowly built up to this. The war was caused because of this happening, but this didn't just happen all overnight. It took 2 or 3 years sometimes for the cause of the war to build up. So we can actually cover multiple years in a single day and still get the history. But going that route, again, we have to start talking about alternate possibilities and what other people believed, and not necessarily the whole main story we normally go through. So, time's a factor. We could split American history into 2 years instead of a 1 year course, and do a better job of teaching it. Do we want to do that? I'm sticking mainly to high school education here, so saying we don't want to do that because we have several other courses the students are taking, so we want to keep history short so they can learn other stuff. That makes some sense. You get into college, you can start breaking it down some. So instead of studying American history, you might be able to study a concept instead of a nation. And so, yes, America did take part in this concept, but we aren't going to spend all of our time talking about America necessarily. We're going to say how it's affected the rest of the world. It's not this led to this, led to this, led to this. It is this thing happened and people did it differently in this part of the world as they did it differently in that part of the world. So you can break it down into shorter times too. So instead of American history, we're getting World War I history, and you might be able to take a course in it, and you'll get different nations' points of view. You'll get more detail into it because you're not spending you're covering what 5 or 6 years, 4 to 6 years, rather than trying to cover 200 years. So you can do into more detail. But that's, again, going to be in college. You aren't going to do that in high school. So that's just one example of how, I'm limiting myself to high school history because that's one example of how it could be different, but it never is. We Now, one thing I hated about American history, and that's one thing, most teachers will come up and say, "Oh, this is not all about just memorizing dates and places and events." And then for the next year, you memorize places, dates, and events. And that big lie comes about because they don't want to go into detail or they aren't very good at it. Now, the Civil War, American Civil War, I hated it. Primarily because, one, we had a history teacher, had him for junior high, then they moved him to the high school and I had him again. And he considered himself a Civil War buff when he wasn't a very good teacher to begin with. And again, the Civil War, he wasn't very good at teaching the Civil War either. So I had to suffer through that 2 years. History Channel had a series on the Civil War, or several shows on the Civil Wars. Whether it was one series or whether it was just different shows, I don't remember. But watch it. It was pretty good. I actually like the Civil War now because it wasn't just, places and events and dates and memorizing this stuff. They wouldn't think they had an episode, espionage during the Civil War. They had an episode on, how it affected the economy in certain industries. And so they went into detail that you don't get in high school because you don't have time to in high school. And again, if we had done that, I would have liked history more in high school, and I would have wanted to study it more. Strange thing now, elementary school, we studied history, and they would say, do a report, pick a famous figure and do a report on him. So we'd all go to the library and we'd get a book out on him, or go to, the encyclopedia, and would basically be one source, write our report. And of course, this is the elementary school library, so our history books are maybe 100 pages long, 150 pages long. Not as much detail as you would get in another more adult book, let's say, more mature book, which isn't bad of it by itself, but again, you're not getting a lot of detail. You're not learning how to study history. You're basically just copying from a book. You're getting some facts you wouldn't get if you weren't writing the report, but that's it. Then we go on to high school, and I went to a fairly good high school. History, we never really had to write a history paper on anything. Or if we did, it was fairly, I don't know, not as much emphasis on it. So the idea we're going to actually, now that we know how to write a paper of sorts, we're not going to do that. We're not going to go to, okay, I want 5 or 6 sources on this when you write your report. There was very little, let's do some outside of class research, or how to do outside of class research. And so, as a result, we didn't learn how to study history on our own. Which again, that doesn't mean running around and following every revisionist history theory out there. But it does mean going and getting some facts that you aren't going to get from your textbook. Things that they just don't have time to study. It raises your interest in history, so you might want to go out and read more of it in the future on your own when after graduating. Never happened. So that's number 2. So 1, cut down on the time, instead of trying to cover the entire American history, break it down into shorter periods. 2, encourage more outside research. Teach the kids how to study it on their own rather than learning these facts. Show them how to look up the facts on their own. Show them some conflicting sources. Give them reason to get interested in searching for history. That would do a lot more good than just memorize these dates, these places, these people, which they claim they aren't going to do, but they end up doing all along. And that's it. That's pretty much how I would do history. Reform history, go more into how to study it rather than just here's the facts that you have to memorize. Go into, yes, there are different versions of it, and we're going to study why these people believe this, why these other people believe something different, and shorten it so we aren't trying to stretch out. We can put more detail into the individual facts we are showing. That's it. Have a nice day.